we're kind of here for all of it. So to get started, we'll introduce ourselves. Do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm David Cooper. I have been doing digital health now for well over 10 years at the DoD, VA, with various startups, and now at Teladoc Health. I do clinical product strategy, oversee, make sure our things work well. I've overseen some of our international launches, so I can talk a little bit about that and the role that plays. But yeah, that's what I do. Mike?
Awesome, yeah. Hey everyone, my name's Mike Arevalo. I've been working in digital health now for about 2 years, so early career in digital health. I work as a clinical development lead for a digital therapeutics company called Big Health. And right now I also am starting to work within being embedded in the product development process. I'm working a lot within our go-to-market strategy right now, commercializing our digital therapeutic products for commercialization launch to be fit for adults as well as adolescents now for millions of users. And it's really exciting to be able to ensure scientific, rigorous products and as well as our process for it.
Yeah. My name is Kay. I use they, them pronouns. I've been in health tech a little under 10 years. And I'm currently in the process of finishing out my clinical psych PhD, which y'all can ask questions about doing some of that simultaneously if you want. And right now I am currently the head of clinical and research at Violet. So I created our products and now I am studying the products that I created, which I'll say as a researcher is very, very satisfying. And yeah, so our agenda is pretty simple. We're going to have 2 mini presentations from Mike and Dave. We have a couple of frequently asked questions that we get frequently asked very, very often between clinicians, researchers, students, things that people oftentimes really want to know, and we take meetings about pretty regularly to chat with people about, and then some audience Q&A. But I'm going to say, if you have any questions at any point, please ask. If you have any comments at any point, please ask. And if you all have comments for one another, that's also acceptable. And so what I want to say before we get started is every single symposium that I submitted to APA this year had to do with psychologists and health tech in one way or another. Yesterday I presented on psychologists working on health equity using technology, and today this is really, what do psychologists do? What does that look like? It's pretty mystified, and I think health tech, especially tech with a capital T, could be very intimidating for folks, and can feel very distant from maybe what psychologists can do. And one of my goals is all of these products are being built. There's billions of dollars being funded into the industry. I will always call this out. We can talk about capitalism in healthcare for a really long time, and I would love to. But the advancements are happening, the development is happening, and it's oftentimes happening without the psychologist in the room, without the psychologist making the decisions on clinical care or clinical efficacy or the things that we should be measuring or the things that patients care about. And so my goal is really to start to merge. When I go to industry events, I talk about clinical care. When I come here, I talk about health tech. So trying to bridge some of those gaps. So I'll get started with a quote. I teach I oftentimes guest lecture for psychology careers classes for undergrads for them to kind of learn about what it is that they could be doing. And I think there's a lot of conversation around more traditional paths, but this is what I always start with. This is my intro quote. So the quote is, "The main fission in psychology is that between academic psychology and professional psychology. Clinical, industrial, and social psychology, among other applied fields, have expanded dramatically. Experimental psychology itself is now being professionalized. Most psychology graduates will wind up in professional work outside universities and colleges. One solution is to, quote unquote, set up a school forthrightly embracing both academic and professional graduate training. There would be an academic department and a separate professional department. We're going to do an audience poll. This is by a psychologist who is an academic. When do you think that what year do you think this quote is from? Any guess?
Shout it out.
Shout it out.
1963.
It is 1963.
Wow.
Wow, well done.
Right on.
Are you a plant?
Yeah.
I do work on staff at APA, but that was literally like a guess. I was thinking like some decades.
Okay, all right, because I was at a symposium yesterday about extraordinary experiences, and I feel like you and I have to talk about that because
ESP.
Okay, well it's the surprise is taken, but yes, it was written in 1963 by our esteemed Sweet siren. And the reason why I like to bring it up is if I really go back to this, like this could be written today. This could be written 5 years ago. This could be written when psychologists as consultants was coming out as a concept. You know, this continues to kind of pervade. And right now, a lot of this conversation is psychologists in health tech specifically. So the main points of the article, really, from 1963 again, where there's an increasing divisiveness among psychologists stemming from their expanding usefulness, which I actually really like her expanding usefulness, the emergence of professional psychology and professionalization outside of academic psychology. Academic psychology institutions are disturbed by these trends and the need for professional training in psychology to equip students for their actual future careers. The main points of the article still stand, and the main points of the article really stand for psychologists in health tech. The amount of conversations that we have between us really talking about the last part is very important to us because there should and can be more training around this, and I think a lot of us are doing that informally. So I am going to really quickly jump to health tech. So I wanted to give a definition. This is pretty much the consistent definition that I use, but this is from the World Health Organization. Although I will give a shout out to the APA Mental Health Tech Advisory Committee that Dave and I are on, because we were coming up with a new definition that will hopefully be used by the APA. And so this definition is a health technology is the application of organized knowledge and skills in the form of devices, medicines, vaccines, and procedures, and systems developed to solve a health problem and improve quality of lives. And what I'll say is nowadays there are thousands and thousands, potentially tens of thousands of apps and companies and people really in this space. And so we are here to really talk about what it's like being a psychologist in the room with the engineers, with the business people, sometimes being the business people. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to Mike.
Nice, yeah, thank you so much, Kay. I think that's a really great handoff because there's so many different types of digital health technologies. There's all these different kinds of apps. And for me, specifically, I work in the field of digital therapeutics. I've done a lot of presentations in of itself on just digital therapeutics and what digital therapeutics are. And so I'm not gonna be talking about all of that within this time, because I can go an hour into it, but just to kind of simplify, a digital therapeutic is a device that is intended to treat, manage, and prevent a disease. And so in what I work in with being in the field of digital therapeutics within mental health is I work on products, I work on devices that deliver evidence-based treatments to patients with the intent to treat, manage, and prevent a disease. So a lot of it is going to be cognitive behavioral therapy delivered for different kinds of mental health conditions. So whether it's depression, whether it's anxiety, insomnia, and trying to ensure and help patients with their outcomes and be a place in the step care model. So done other presentations on where digital therapeutics fall in the step care model, but what I want to talk about is my role, right? Because I don't think that's often talked about enough. If I say I'm a psychologist in tech, what does that mean? Well, I'm a psychologist in the field of digital therapeutics. Okay, but then what does that mean? Well, my day-to-day typically is I work embedded in clinical product teams to help out and ensure that everything's evidence-based, the science is there, and ensuring flexibility of how to do things. And so typically I work day to day with, as Kay was saying, a product manager. I work with an engineer. I work with a designer, a user designer. I work with a UX researcher. I work with a content designer. And we're always trying to figure out ways of how we're going to deliver this type of therapeutic, this type of treatment to people in a way that is still clinically effective and in a way that patients can stay engaged and actually get through the treatment. So what I want to say here in my first point is there's no secret sauce. And what I mean by that is there's no really defined way of what it means to be a clinical psychologist in product development. And it's actually, from talking to a lot of my colleagues and talking to other people in the field of digital therapeutics, because there are other digital therapeutics companies, is that everyone does things differently. There's no, sometimes clinical psychologists are brought in as a consultant. And so the product teams would work on something and they'll bring in a psychologist, and then the psychologist's role is to say, that doesn't align with an evidence-based protocol, or I don't think that will really land with this certain population. Sometimes they're embedded and they're not consultants, but they go through the entire product development process. And what I mean by that is they talk to a PM initially, and then they talk about, okay, what are we going to design and what are we going to create together, and give me your clinical input if you think this would be helpful or not. If we're going to start an onboarding flow in an app and we're asking tons of questions, is that aligned with what could be helpful for their treatment and making it more personalized? And so there's no secret sauce for any of this that we're doing, and it kind of changes. It's constantly changing depending on where we are within a product development process, as well as where we are within a company strategy. So that's important to know, is that there's no defined way, there's no standard protocol of what it means to be a clinical psychologist in product development. For my second point, is flexibility is key. And what I mean by that is there really isn't a one-to-one translation of evidence-based protocols into product. We can't just take an EBP and then just digitize it. That's not how it works, because there are so many nuances and so many considerations that everybody has to have, and especially in understanding how are we going to help with engagement, but not just engagement for engagement's sake, but clinical engagement, meaningful engagement, because I think that also gets lost in translation as well, which brings me to my next point of you are now in sales. Because a lot of other stakeholders within these product development teams, as I mentioned, an engineer or the product manager, or as Kay was talking about, even business leaders or executives, we want engagement. We don't want any drop-offs in our products. We want people to continue throughout the entire product. But as a psychologist, right, like we want meaningful engagement. We want to ensure that they're attaining the clinical ingredients of it. We want to ensure that the clinical ingredients are sound within the product itself, and that patients are all receiving the effective clinical dose of what's going on within the product. And so there's constantly I constantly feel like I'm in this sales position of, okay, this is my belief, this is my stance, now I need to sell it to you so that you understand where I'm coming from. And it is constantly a give and take here. Because again, it's not always about doing everything the way an evidence-based protocol did. It's not always about doing everything that other people want to do, other stakeholders want to do, but it's more so about finding the balance to be able to collaborate on a project, to be able to help the people that we're trying to serve in a way that it is safe and effective. And that is what's truly, truly important, and a little bit of what I do in my role within Healthtech. And
Thank you so much. And I think one of the conversations that Mike and I oftentimes have is just the impact of some of this work, of being able to create something and then have it touch thousands, potentially millions of lives. And that's part of, I think, also one of the reasons why we're so passionate about it, is because that reach is just so far. And if that reach can be positive, if that reach can be evidence-based, that has a pretty big effect. So that's, I think, one of our passions. And I'm going to go to Dave.
Yeah, and so Mike talked a lot about what it's like to work in a specific part of tech, specifically what we call product, or the people that actually work and build the apps. There's a lot of other roles for psychologists in these digital health companies. You could work in content, right? We need people to help us create evidence-based content for these products. You could work on the clinical operations side, whether that's in direct care in terms of telehealth. You can supervise folks. You can help us with licensure. You can help us with onboarding people into the product. Hey, you're a new provider coming to deliver care on our platform. How do we make sure you're educated and taken care of and get all the things you need as a provider on our platform? You can work in research. So like at Teladoc, we have specific PhDs who do research on our products to make sure what we're doing is evidence-based, help us come up with discoveries, insights like, oh, hey, if you see your mental health provider, we can also show your diabetes gets better. And then that helps us sell more contracts. So we can do that kind of stuff. You can also work in usability research, talking with the patients that actually use the apps. Hey, how is this working for you? What could be better? And then you work with the product team to actually implement that and study that in sort of a iterative process. So one of the reasons I got into psychology that I think also kind of translates into the tech field is there's a lot of diverse career options outside the normal, oh, I'm either going to be an academic or I'm going to be a clinical person, right? It seems like sometimes that's the only dichotomy that we have. We have to choose one or the other. There's, in addition to tech, there's tons of available jobs in private sector, but it can be challenging, right? There's not that many of us. You know, there's not like a defined, oh, okay, I do this and then I go here and this specific externship leads to this. So it can be a little bit of the Wild West. The other thing that's nice about working in digital health, as opposed to, I can remember when I was doing clinical practice, it's much easier to leave the job at the end of the day, right? When you're seeing like 8 hours a day, you're turning those RVUs of I'm seeing patients every day, and it's not like sad patients who are kind of existentially depressed, but like suicidal patients. At the end of the day, you are just spent, and you go home and you plop on the couch and watch Netflix and eat like the cheese and crackers and then go to sleep, right?
I still do that.
I do that. There's some days I have boy dinner. Yeah. Some days I definitely have boy dinner at the end of the day. But it is much more of you work the job, not necessarily the hours. So, like I work remotely. So, oh, hey, I need to run to the store in the middle of the day. Yeah, fine. I can go run, grab my groceries. I don't have meetings. I can come back, answer my emails. It's a very flexible sort of job arrangement, more so than, say, going to a clinic. And as Kay alluded to, you can really have a huge impact. It was really set for me in one of my first projects that I worked on. It was an app that had been downloaded over 4 million times. And I just had to kind of sit with that. Once I read it, I was like, wow, I could never see 4 million patients over my entire career. But with one app, I've helped 4 million people with learn diaphragmatic breathing, right? Like a simple skill that can be effective. So, it can be a way to really expand your reach and still stay connected to what brings so many of us into care, which is, we want to do this to make people's lives better. What it is not, and I want to do a little bit of myth busting, it's certainly not a solution to all of your problems with care. It's not necessarily a solution to burnout. I talk to a lot of therapists who are like, hey, I'm really burnt out seeing patients. What's tech like? I want to transition. And I'm like, bad news. It's a different kind of burnout, right? Because you're trading, the emotional exhaustion for maybe, some high tempo stuff. If you're working at a startup, right? When I said you work the job, not necessarily the hours, sometimes those hours are few, sometimes they're many, right? And you have to, I have to stay up late, or like I have to meet with our UK team at like 5 a.m. because that's when they're awake and that's when I'm awake on the Pacific coast, right? So it can be a different kind of burnout, and is certainly not a cure-all. It's also not amazing salaries for everybody. I talk to a lot of psychologists who are like, oh, well, those engineers at Google, they make like 300, 500K a year. That's what we're going to make, right? Or, I've seen the chief medical officer position at, Optum makes, 200-300K a year. That's what I should tell the startup I'm thinking of working for, that I want my salary to be for their chief medical officer. And I'm like, oh no, the CEO of a startup isn't making that kind of money for a lot of these things. So it's not, again, is it more than you're probably going to make in community mental health? Sure. But you're not going to be making like pulling down, $500,000 a year in like your first year. I'll let you know when I hit $500,000 a year. It's also not necessarily a stable job. And I mean that because working for a startup, you can come and go, right? Like the whole point of a startup is, it is a company that is still trying to figure out what we call product market fit. Can I make something that somebody is willing to buy? That's the whole point of many startups for the first couple of years, is how do I make something that someone is willing to pay me money for? And sometimes they don't figure that out. You're seeing a lot of layoffs in the industry now from folks like Headspace, a lot of these digital health companies, because they can't fundraise as well as they could a couple years ago. Revenues are tighter because we have so many mental health companies. So it can be, again, compared to a lot of the traditional things like academia, like, a mental health center, it certainly can be less stable. Not to say it is completely chaotic and unstable, but that's just something to know going into it, as far as if you're thinking about maybe I want to go into tech and look at that. But I'll turn it back over.
Great. So those are our presentations.
Little mini presentations.
Mini presentations, as I mentioned. So before we get started on some of the frequently asked questions that we get, we definitely have a lot of those. Any thoughts, any comments, any questions?
quite a bit. And I think at the onset you were talking about sort of this mismatch between education versus kind of getting into this field. So I was wondering, this might be a frequently asked question, but I was wondering if you would be able to speak to all of you a little bit about like your trajectory from like education to this. And I know you're doing it simultaneously, which is whoa.
Whoa to me too. I don't know.
Me too.
Yeah, same here. That's whoa.
So I'd love to hear that piece of it, just because I understand it's not going to be this ladder, but just kind of like how to put yourself out there, how to maybe, as I'm in education right now, studying right now, like how to maybe convert some like good opportunities to explore some of these areas a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm just going to repeat it. Basically, the question is how did we get from education to now to health tech? So do you want to start, Mike?
Yeah, I'll go ahead. My path was, I guess more recent, since I've been in digital health for about 2 years now, and there really wasn't any kind of playbook for any of this. I kind of fumbled around for a while and figured it out, and thankfully I spoke to a lot of people. I got connected with a Slack community called Therapists in Tech.
Yes.
Plug for Therapists in Tech. That's where I met Kay, and that's where I met Dave, and they were both so kind in speaking with me and helping me learn a little bit more about digital health. And so that was kind of like, I just started talking to people. I just started networking. I started reaching out and doing informational interviews. I started, seeing people post, within Therapists in Tech, they'll put their position. I'm like, hey, that's a really cool position. I want to reach out respectfully. And I understand everyone's time is very valuable. And so I would, reach out respectfully and ask, hey, like, if you have any time at all, would love to. I can, and drop a personal note of, hey, I also went to the same grad school, or my parents live here, and it was always very much appreciated, and people were always really kind and friendly to help me understand a little bit. And then I started reaching out a little bit more and started consulting for a couple of early stage startups. How I did that was there's a website called Angel List. I think they changed their name now.
Well-found.
Well-found. Yeah, it's Well-found. Yeah, and so Well-found is a website where a lot of early startups kind of post positions or post need, and they give you kind of information about their company. And so I just kind of went on there and started, searching mental health, and then started reaching out, started talking to a couple of CEOs, and they were interested in the clinical value that I have, which is something that I don't think is often talked about how much we as psychologists have value to digital health companies. We are most of the time the only ones in the room who have been talking to patients, who know about things from a clinical perspective. And so it was really awesome to be able to kind of talk to these CEOs who were interested in my value. And so they did put me on in a contract to start consulting. And then it just little by little, steps by steps. And then I finally started applying for more full-time roles. And that's how I kind of started getting to the field of digital health, because I was starting to see, what do I like? What am I gravitating towards? What's really fun for me? And that's really exciting, because like I did this in grad school in terms of like what I wanted to focus in clinically, but now I'm doing it in a different way of, what is it? Because digital health is such a broad field, as Dave was mentioning, right? There's so many different roles and positions a psychologist can have. And so I really gravitated towards a certain area, and then just kind of went from there. Dave, do you want to?
Really quickly, do you mind sharing what you were doing right just before your job?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Previously I was working for a large managed healthcare organization. I was working as a clinical psychologist in Kaiser, and I was running the outpatient department down in Orange County in Southern California.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'll say, again, just to be transparent up at the top, a lot of it was luck, right? Like I got hooked up through the group at the DoD, through a former professor who knew some folks. I was going out there to interview for a completely different job, and then ended up getting the one I had where, I was working on building these apps. But I think the thing that helped me there, and the thing that is beneficial compared to, again, I'll do a compare and contrast between sort of the traditional, maybe academic or clinical model where, hey, if you're going into academic, well, you need to have this many papers, and you need to do this postdoc, and you need to there's like or on the clinical side, you have to get this many hours, and then you should get boarded. And then, there's very kind of prescriptive hoops. And if you don't have credential A, B, or C, or you don't have the exact number of hours, you can't progress to that next level. Conversely, in tech, really what I want to know is, can you do the job? And quite frankly, there's not a lot stopping you. compared to academia or clinical work. So like one of the things I mentioned is working in content. If you want to work in content for a health tech thing, write a blog, write a LinkedIn profile, write something for Psychology Today. And then when you interview for the job, go, here's all the articles I've written. Here are the samples of my writing style so that I can go, oh, okay, this is how they write. That's going to work for me, or that's not going to work for me, right? If you want to do product, you could, again, write an article breaking down, hey, I played around with this app. This is what I thought was good. This is what I thought could be improved. Here's how I would change it, right? Showing that you can make those thoughts and decisions. And I think that is one of the better parts of tech, is it really is a little bit more democratized in that way of just, hey, I really just want to know, can you do the job? Not, oh, hey, I've taken this Google course and I've taken this and I've got this certification. Those help, right, as evidence, but it really is just, hey, can you do the job? You don't need a specific qualification.
I want to do a quick plug for everything he's saying, because I spoke to Dave, I don't know if you remember, it was like 2 years ago. I don't know if you remember that. You were,
so.
Dave is the pipeline.
Yeah, Dave,
I'm a gateway.
Dave was my gateway. So when I got into therapists and tech in that community, I spoke to one person, and then the second person I spoke to actually was Dave.
Yeah.
And Dave gave me that exact same advice as he's saying right now. I kid you not. And what did I go do? I created a portfolio.
Yep.
And I started documenting all the things that I was doing, and that helped me get my first consultant role, because they were like, oh, cool, you have a portfolio. Oh, cool, you're reviewing all this. Oh, cool, you
That's
know
what
what you're
we need
doing.
you to do. That's what we need you to do. Do that for us.
Awesome. So he's speaking truths, only truths.
And I'll speak to my path. Well, I'll speak in general. I think the health tech space is very sort of DIY.
Yeah.
I have never met two people who have had the same trajectory.
Yep.
I'll speak specifically on the student side. What I've seen really helps for folks is really just truly just reaching out to health tech folks who are doing the thing that you want to do. And so many of us take those calls, take those chats, take those Slacks, take those anything. I text with some folks. And so it's kind of part of being in health tech as a psychologist to pretty much help other people who want to get into it. Like we do reach our capacity, and then we kind of shuffle around. But even right now, Mike and I are co-chairing a mentorship program for TNT, and a lot of folks there are students or people who want to transition. So like those resources are available. We're like all TNT fans, so they'll hear about this later. But TNT also has a podcast really focused on individuals talking about their trajectory. So there's I think like 14 folks who've talked about it, so that's a good way. And I'll speak to myself, because speaking of chaos, this was chaotic. So I finished a BA in psychology, and I was like, a clinical psych PhD is in my future, and also that seems like a huge commitment at 22. So I'm gonna go like do things. And I also wanted to make sure that I was, that I wanted to be in the field. I will also say, when we talk about our path, retrospectively, it makes way more sense than when we're doing it. So like, this is a nice narrative. When I was doing it, none of it made any sense to me. So what I'll say, I managed a psychology laboratory. I worked as a housing case manager. I did meditation courses at an integrated care center. I there's just like a number of things that I ended up doing. I was like a manager at a private practice, so I got a chance to sample. And honestly, I kind of got into tech by accident. And I'll say the trajectory. I had been at some point when I was doing this management of a private practice, the thing that I hated, well, it was a private practice, but some of the therapists took insurance, and I hated insurance because it was awful, and we could have that as a whole conversation, but it was just really difficult to get reimbursement. And I was on the phone there, because I was the person, I was on the phone, we were arguing the whole thing every single day, this was just on the phone. And I was in New York City at the time, and in New York City at the time, there was a startup, I will not name it, that was actively plastering itself. This was in the early days before everyone was plastering. A New York City subway, they had a bunch of cartoon characters, because that was the vibe in 2015, and 2015, 2014, and it said, make insurance human. And I was like, yes, I like that, we should do that. And I looked them up and I applied for a job. And it's like, did I have the skills necessary? I mean, you talk about what had worked, but I didn't even have, a graduate degree at the time. And so I ended up working for them, and that was where I realized I really love system level problems. My brain works in a system level. I love one-on-one care, and as a grad student, I've really come to enjoy it. Still don't plan on doing it, but come to enjoy it. But I really love solving problems that solve problems for a lot of people using very difficult systems. And so insurance space, it was really interesting to be able to solve that. And so when I decided that I wanted to get my PhD, the intention had really been to then bolster my career in health tech, because we need more clinical psych folks in health tech, and I saw that. And so right now, kind of being in the midst of it, I can't really tell you what comes next. I have a very atypical trajectory, but I think that example of like, oh, I want to make insurance more human, go on the website, see what they have available, apply. That was not the job that I left with. And that was not the job that I even wanted, but that was the job that they had available. So one of the things that I'll say is sometimes folks that we talk to, students or psychologists, get really hung up on like, I want this job. And oftentimes in tech, the point is just to get the first health tech job. And sometimes the first health tech job is below salary, is below qualifications, but you are in that ecosystem, as we call it. And I'll also give a plug. I know I've been talking for a while, but I want to give a plug for a master's level student who I met actually at one of those career classes that I taught. I did a lecture very similar to this. She came up to me right after. She had already added me on LinkedIn. She came up to me, asked me I had my email there. She said, hey, can I connect with you? Sure. By the time I left the building, she had emailed me already. And then at that point, I connected her with Therapists in Tech, at which point she became very, very active there, and then ended up interning for one of the people who started Therapists in Tech and now has transitioned to a full-time role, and now is also co-chair with Mike and I on the mentorship program. So, it's a lot of it, I think, is as my grandmother would call it, chutzpah. You just kind of like do the thing. So I'll acknowledge one thing though, is it's really important to acknowledge privilege within all of that. So I don't think everyone has the same level playing ground. And also there are people who are available to help you move in that direction. I'm going to stop talking. Cool. I love that. No, but thank you so much for that question, because it's mystified.
Yeah, I definitely want to say, like, my path was, like, and I'll be honest, I think this is the place to be, like, honest and real. My path was, like, tons of rejection. Like, I applied to so many positions to trying to get my foot in the door, and it was like, nope, you don't have no industry experience. Nope, you have no industry experience. Nope, hey, nice portfolio. You don't have any industry experience. And, like, so that's, like, my path to get consulting was like, oh, that was great. It was fun for me, but also it was something I could put on my resume that's, like, bigger companies are like, oh, okay, he has some industry experience now. And so it's like, it isn't as easy as I maybe, even when I was telling about my story, it wasn't that easy and as Kay was saying, in the middle of it, I was just trying to figure it out.
We're here for honesty. Okay, any other questions, comments? Yeah, please.
I guess, it was a similar question, but how do you quickly adapt from a previous environment in a more fast-paced?
Yeah, and I'll just repeat the question. The question is, how did we adapt, to a new environment, especially a fast-paced environment? So, sir.
For me, the nice thing about tech, again, I say, as compared to academia or clinical, there is a lot less gatekeeping of information. There's a lot less behind paywalls in terms of getting journals, or paying to go and get like certain classes. Oh, I've got to learn this, left-handed CBT. I know right-handed CBT, and now I got to learn left-handed, right? Like, there's a lot less of that. YouTube University is where I got my degree in tech, quite frankly, because there is enough out there that you can learn from. I'll take product, for example. One of the ways I learned to do product was watching YouTube talks from people at Google and Meta and a lot of the tech companies about how they did it. And then I would have to go, okay, that's how they did it. This is how I can extrapolate that to healthcare and think about that. So a lot of the information is out there. It is just a lot more self-serve. And if everyone wants to know resources, I'm an open book, because again, it's like, I've got a long list of stuff that I collected over time, and now if I hand it to you, you know as much as I do. Like, there's one YouTube channel I will shout out called A Healthcare Z. Terrible name, but great guy. It's an MD who's worked in a clinical setting and for self-insured employers and for payers. So anytime I need to know, how does a PBM work? What's does
a PBM?
Pharmacy benefit manager, thank you. How does a pharmacy benefits manager work? What do hospital CEOs really care about? I go and I look, and yep, sure enough, he's got a video on it, and it's straight talk of, this is how the finances work, this is what they're tracking, and I'm like, great, that helps me understand it enough to go to the next level. So I'm always like, part of not having a defined kind of path or a kind of thing is you just go and collect these little resources along the way, and then you share them with people, and then we all kind of share them together.
Yeah, I would say in the adjustment for me personally, I ended up taking the Coursera Google Project Management certification online, and it completely changed my view of things and understanding the language that people are going to be talking about within the companies they're going to be working for. Like I had to learn about, okay, like what is agile methodology? Like what is a design sprint? Like what does it mean about, what is the product development life cycle? Like what does that exactly mean? And it's like once you learn all those, then the fast-paced environment, although still fast-paced, you're able to like keep up a little bit. And then also trying to find your own systems that work for you too. I think that now at this point, my superpower is context switching, because literally my day to day is I'm in a business, I'm in a meeting with executives talking about the clinical strategy, and then the next meetings I'm in a content. I'm doing content review with our content lead in the new flow, and then I meet with our project. Our product manager and figuring out what's the cycle that we're going to be working on. And so it's like just over time it becomes helpful. I keep little notes on my side to context switch like that, but knowing the language, knowing a little bit more about the field, and then finding a system that can work for you, like that's been helpful for me.
A real quick example of that is when I left the DoD and went and joined a startup, I literally had a document during meetings called stuff to look up after the meeting. When somebody would say something, I would write it down and go and Google it after the meeting, so that I would just sit there and smile and nod like I knew what they were talking about. And then conversely, I also was taking notes of like, oh, how do we implement this product at a new customer? Because like I was the only other, like there was one other guy doing it and he wasn't writing it down. So I'm like, I just need to write it down for my own sense of knowledge. That became the company documentation on how we launched it. Like, so you can have these kind of outsized impacts. And again, you know, people are like, oh, how do you fix imposter syndrome? And I'm like, I don't know. When I find out, I will let you know. But I feel like we all feel it for like the first 6 to 12 months at any new job in tech. Like, yeah, we're just sitting there smiling and nodding and looking up stuff after a meeting.
Wait, so you don't have that anymore?
Oh no, I still occasionally have it. I'm just gotten a lot better about smiling and nodding.
So I'll say on my end, there's this joke that I have with especially new hires at larger startups, where when they just first start and you're kind of seeing them like, and these are people who are like project managers, product managers, designers, like everybody, you're kind of just wandering around with your eyes really wide, meeting to meeting. And I was like, you're drinking from the fire hose, aren't you? Which, you know, maybe is not the best in terms of, in terms of kind of long-term thing, but it is, even people who are tech with a capital T, people in companies similar to starting any job, you feel like there's a lot happening, because the interesting thing that I like is actually every company is so different. So it's not just transitioning from clinical care or from academia or from anything like that into tech. It's really transitioning from company to company. And that's also okay. It's also okay to be overwhelmed. The first thing that I'll say is I think clinical psychologists or psychologists in general know a little bit more about actual emergencies than maybe tech people. And so I think on my end, one of the things that's been really helpful is like, I've taken patients to the ER. Like I know what an emergency looks like somebody not getting, maybe somebody not getting a feature in time is like not an emergency. So I think internally it's just like, it alleviates a lot of the stress, which I think some of us is like, it makes us a little bit more calmer than maybe folks in the environment. And I think the other part of it is honestly, as intimidating as it can be, as disorienting as it can be, for me, it's so immensely exciting. Part of the reason why I'm here is because I personally like novelty as a person. And I like solving problems that people don't think can be solvable on a large scale. And so while that can be intimidating, and sometimes I sit in front of a document for a new project being like, okay, I have no idea about any of this. So I'm just gonna start writing and we'll see what comes out at the end. That in of itself is very intellectually stimulating, and that's one of the things that I really want. And in addition to being intellectually stimulating, I also, with all the intensity of it, which sometimes, honestly, my days are pretty chill nowadays. I've been in a company for 3 years, and it's pretty mellow at this point. But I can also sometimes have very teary-eyed moments. I'm gonna call it the teary-eyed moments, where recently, and I know this is kind of deviating from your question, but I gotta give this a shout out. The company that I'm at, as part of my strategy for education, created a trans and gender nonconforming course for mental health providers. It's 1 hour learning how to write support letters. Literally at the end of the hour, you should know how to write support letters. You will have a template on how to write support letters. And that's a big deal. And then thank you. And then as soon as that came out, I'm reading this thing and I'm crying because I realize that we have thousands of clinicians who are going to be seeing this. We have thousands of clinicians who are going to be assigned this, who are going to be able to do this. So sitting down to think about how we were going to do that, very intimidating. The output, sometimes, I'll just sit and, like, I'm a crier, but like I'll sit and cry and be very touched by the work that we do.
Yeah.
Any other questions, thoughts? Yeah, please.
Hi, I'm a pathologist. I'm not a
Yes.
psychologist. And I'm doing a project on how the future of therapy is changing and folks. But just was wondering about sort of in the landscape of mental health tech, which is so huge, and there are apps and platforms. There's the wellness industry also, and that's sort of I just was wondering, how do you differentiate between different companies, or how to align, make sure that there's alignment, sort of ethically. Also, your thoughts about, you said there's not much stopping you, right? Also thoughts about when things should be stopped, or moments where like, actually there should be a regulatory mechanism. I know those are big.
Those
I
are.
want to repeat that. So the
Yeah.
question is, I'll say the second one first. Is there, because there's not that much stopping us from being able to get into tech, should there be things that are stopping us? And then what was the first one? Just to repeat to the ethics, yeah.
Just ethics alignment. How do you?
Yeah,
kind
how
of
do we find
define
alignment
stuff?
with companies when we're doing this work? I think that's a great question. I love that. Yeah.
I'll tackle alignment. I'll let you talk about regulatory stuff, Mr. DTX.
I'm in there, yeah.
I think so. Again, as much as you see in the news about companies getting funding, you see all these big names. The field itself is still in the early days. Again, as somebody who's doing this, like when mobile phones came out and like apps and like that kind of stuff, we're still figuring a lot of this out. One good part of it is there's a lot of us and a lot of different groups trying to kind of come up with some definitions. So for me, the one I really like is done by an organization called the Digital Medicine Society. And so what they say is there's the big umbrella of digital health, right? And that's everything from prescription digital therapeutics to your Fitbit, right? Anything health related having to do with apps and sensors and whatnot. Then the niche down from that is digital medicine, anything that we are actually using to treat patients, whether it's operating in and of itself as a prescription digital therapeutic does, or it is the EKG at the hospital, something that has a particularly medical bent. And then you have digital therapeutics, which are things designed to act in and of themselves, right? So many of you psychologists are familiar with like homework apps or things that would help a patient, do stuff while you're doing with therapy. A digital therapeutic is something I could theoretically give to a patient and have it cure them of depression, anxiety, whatever, all on its own.
I'm giving us a 5-minute warning.
Okay, without me being involved. So I think looking around, that is one definition that I like, and I'll let you speak to the regulatory part of it, because.
And I'll go back to the ethics.
Yeah, so we do have to follow, so with the field of digital therapeutics, right, like we do have to follow FDA regulations to be an FDA regulated product, and because of that, we do have to submit evidence that our devices are safe and effective. And so in order to do that, we do a lot of pivotal trials and research trials, and then a big part of my role, one of my many hats that I wear, is ensuring safety within these clinical trials. And so there's never been too much of a pushback from other people within the team when it comes down to our trials, because it's for the FDA to submit for FDA regulation. And so, as in terms of like safety and what you mentioned before, that's never been, concern. But in the world of digital health apps, right, it's like an understanding, well, how do we market this digital therapeutic versus a wellness product? And what's wild to me is that it's based a lot on the claims that you're making. So one FDA cleared digital therapeutic could very well also be a wellness product, as long as they're not making claims that it's treating, managing, and preventing a disease. And so there's this fine line of navigating of like, well, how are we as a company defining or deciding the difference between our FDA regulated product versus a wellness device, and where can that be? And then there's, you know, a lot of talks and conversations that go along with it, because as you can imagine, you know, being a psychologist, you know, I want to be able to ensure like safety and efficacy within the products they're using, but then also from the other side of the business standpoint is we want to be able to sell this and we want to be able to make money off of it. And right now, for those who don't know, the digital therapeutics field is struggling in terms of getting, you know, reimbursement for it from a payer standpoint, as well as from reimbursement from insurances. And so it's like, well, can we pivot to find other ways to, you know, be able to make money from this? And so it is definitely that line, but I know you mentioned 5-minute warning, go ahead.
No, we're down to a couple of minute warning. And I'll speak to the ethics piece. I don't think any of us on the panel have rose-colored glasses about, you know, the industry. And I think that's important to say, because it's not ideal. In an ideal setting, maybe we wouldn't even need all these products because we'd have a functioning healthcare system. I'll say for myself, you know, and we don't, and this is the state of affairs at this current moment. I'll say a couple of things that show, for me, alignment with a company. I think the first one is having clinical leadership within the first couple of hires, or having a very visible from the start clinical co-founder, or just somebody on board. Right now with my company, I was one of the people who came, I was the first person there saying, like, this is, you know, we need to be thinking about this. So when I talk to people who want to join Healthtech, I'm like, is there a visible clinical leader who is a psychologist who really knows what they're talking about, and also advocates for the clinicians and the clinical care of the patients there? So that's the first one. And then I'll speak to the ethics piece. Obviously, there's been a big blow up of news of companies just misbehaving. And it's actually funny because that was the first thing that I brought up. It's not funny that they're misbehaving, but that's the first thing that I brought up on Mike's panel last year at the APA, because I was like, we got to talk about this. What I will say is right now there's a lot of kind of realigning and mechanisms that are kind of tightening the ability for companies to misbehave, in part because insurance companies no longer allow people to just say, this works. There are literal contracts that are tied to dollar values that align and say you have to show clinical efficacy, and also clinical efficacy around health disparities, which is a lot of the work that I feel passionate about. It's one of the few places where I'm like, go insurance. I don't know how that happened, but it works. Another thing is right now companies cannot just make money for a fundraising round by putting together a nice PowerPoint presentation. I can no longer take this to a VC and they'll say, yes, we will give you $10 million on the hope that you do something. I've been asked for research articles as a seed stage company, which is only 2 fundraising rounds removed. That is almost that has never been the case. And you can no longer, like right now that with venture capitalism and investments, they are literally asking, what is the difference in adherence? What is the difference in retention? What are you doing around PHQ-9 scores? They know what PHQ-9 scores are now. That is not the case before. And so in order to fundraise in a very difficult financial situation, companies are being forced to show that they're doing this. And in order to show that they're doing this, which is a conversation that Dave and I had yesterday, we need to all be there. And if we're all there, we can help that. But I will say, you know, this is like a very complex topic. I really like the topic of ethics because it's something that we need to keep in mind. And also consider how ethical is our general healthcare system. So that's the balance that I was told. We're out of time. So what I'll say is I'm available afterwards to chat, to give my personal information, to talk in general. I'm so excited that Mike and Dave joined us, and I'm just going to give them a round of applause. And thank you so much for all coming.